The morning Olivia left for California felt bright and hopeful, but when the taxi turned the corner and disappeared from sight, Ethan Parker stood alone on the sidewalk in Boston with a strange heaviness in his chest, because pride and loneliness can exist at the same time, and he felt both deeply. Olivia had earned her place in a respected graduate program, and he had encouraged her every step of the way, promising that 2 years would pass quickly, that love was stronger than distance, that video calls and weekend flights would be enough. Yet when he walked back into their townhouse that first evening, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to her absence. The kitchen was clean, her favorite mug still by the sink, a light sweater hanging over the chair, small reminders that she would return, but not soon. And Ethan moved slowly through each room, touching objects absent-mindedly, trying to convince himself he was fine, that grown adults handled long-distance marriages all the time, that this was simply a season of growth. The first few nights were manageable because Olivia called often, excited about her campus, her new classmates, the busy schedule that filled her days, and Ethan listened with genuine happiness, telling her about work, about how quiet the house felt, about how proud he was. But once the calls ended, the quiet stretched longer than expected, and he found himself staying up late just to avoid going to bed alone. He began eating simple takeout meals instead of cooking, leaving dishes in the sink longer than usual, skipping laundry for days, not because he was incapable, but because routine felt pointless without someone to share it with. 3 days after Olivia's departure, the doorbell rang unexpectedly, and when Ethan opened the door, Patricia Morgan stood there holding a large container of homemade soup and wearing her usual composed expression, explaining that she had been thinking about him and wanted to make sure he was adjusting well. And though he tried to insist he was fine, he stepped aside and let her in, because the truth was he welcomed the interruption. Patricia moved through the kitchen with quiet confidence, checking the fridge, shaking her head gently at the lack of fresh groceries, placing the soup on the stove as if she had always belonged there, and Ethan watched her with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort, unsure whether to feel like a cared-for son-in-law or a man whose independence was quietly being supervised. She asked about his work, reminded him to keep regular hours, suggested he create a routine while Olivia was away, and her tone was practical but not unkind, the voice of someone who believed structure solved most problems. After that first visit, she began coming by twice a week, sometimes with fresh bread, sometimes with cleaning supplies she claimed were better than his, sometimes just to check in. And Ethan noticed that each time she left, the house felt slightly less empty, as if her presence filled the silence that had settled too heavily in every room. Evenings changed subtly as Patricia lingered longer for tea, sitting across from him at the dining table while they talked about Olivia's childhood stories, about her determination, about how she used to stay up late studying even in high school. And Ethan found comfort in hearing those memories because they connected him to his wife in a new way. One afternoon, Patricia reorganized the pantry without asking, aligning cans neatly, labeling containers, explaining that small order prevented stress, and though Ethan smiled politely, he felt a flicker of awareness that her involvement was growing beyond casual support. Still, he did not object, because loneliness can make even strong people accept help without question. As weeks passed, Olivia's schedule grew busier, her calls sometimes delayed by group projects and long study sessions, and Ethan began waiting for his phone to light up each night, sometimes falling asleep on the couch before she could call, waking in the early hours with disappointment and telling himself it was normal, that ambition required sacrifice. During those evenings when calls were short or postponed, Patricia often seemed to appear at just the right moment, knocking gently on the door with groceries or suggesting they share dinner so he would not eat alone. And Ethan started to notice how easy it felt to talk to her about everyday frustrations, how she listened carefully, how she offered advice grounded in experience, and how her presence softened the sharp edges of solitude. One evening, while washing dishes side by side, their conversation slowed, the clink of plates filling the space between sentences, and Ethan became aware of small details he had never paid attention to before. The calm steadiness of her voice, the careful way she moved, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, and he felt a subtle shift inside himself, not dramatic, not reckless, just a quiet realization that he was looking forward to her visits more than he should. He immediately dismissed the thought, reminding himself she was his mother-in-law, that boundaries were clear, that gratitude did not equal attraction, yet the awareness remained, subtle but present. Later that night, after Patricia left and Olivia called from her dorm room full of laughter and background noise, Ethan felt a strange blend of happiness and guilt. Happiness because his wife sounded alive and inspired, guilt because part of him had enjoyed the earlier conversation more than expected. He reassured himself that nothing inappropriate had happened, that companionship during difficult transitions was natural, but deep down he sensed that emotions could shift quietly if left unchecked. As autumn leaves began falling outside the townhouse, Patricia's visits became more frequent under the simple excuse of checking on him, and Ethan, still adjusting to the rhythm of an empty home, found it harder to decline, unaware that the comfort he welcomed so openly was slowly reshaping the emotional landscape of his quiet, lonely evenings, setting the stage for choices he would soon have to confront. By the time autumn settled fully over Boston, Ethan had grown used to the rhythm of distance, yet that rhythm felt uneven, because Olivia's life in California moved fast, while his evenings moved slowly, and though they still spoke often, her calls became shorter, sometimes rushed between study sessions and new friendships. And Ethan told himself this was normal. That ambition required focus, but after each call ended, he would stare at the blank screen for a few seconds longer than necessary, feeling the quiet press in again. During those same weeks, Patricia's visits became steady and almost expected, arriving on Friday evenings with groceries or on Sunday afternoons with homemade desserts, explaining that she did not want him eating frozen meals every night. And Ethan appreciated the care, even joking that she was running quality checks on his survival skills. Yet beneath the humor, he recognized how much he depended on those visits. They began cooking together regularly, moving around the kitchen with natural ease, sharing small laughs when recipes did not go perfectly, and talking about topics beyond Olivia, about work stress, about Patricia's years rebuilding her life after divorce, about how independence could feel empowering during the day but lonely at night, and Ethan listened with empathy, seeing her not only as his wife's mother, but as a woman who had faced her own disappointments and rebuilt herself with quiet strength. One rainy evening, when wind rattled the windows, the power flickered briefly, and they sat in the dim living room with only a lamp casting soft light across the walls, the house unusually still, and their conversation slowed into longer pauses, not uncomfortable, but charged with awareness, and Ethan felt the strange comfort of shared silence, the kind that usually belonged to couples who understood each other deeply. Patricia spoke softly about how she sometimes missed having someone to talk to at the end of the day, how she admired the way Ethan supported Olivia's dreams, and how rare it was to see such patience, and her words lingered in the air because appreciation, when spoken sincerely, can feel powerful. Ethan felt seen in a way he had not felt for months, and he realized how hungry he was for acknowledgement, for someone physically present to notice his effort, to hear the details that video calls sometimes rushed through. As the weeks continued, they developed habits that felt almost routine. Sunday morning coffee at the kitchen table, midweek dinners when Patricia would drop by after errands, occasional walks around the neighborhood where they discussed books or current events, and though nothing improper occurred, the emotional closeness deepened quietly, shaped by shared time and consistent attention. Ethan began anticipating her messages, asking if he needed anything from the store, noticing how quickly he responded, how easily he adjusted his schedule when she suggested stopping by, and he tried not to examine the reason too closely. One night, Olivia canceled their call because of an important study group meeting, apologizing quickly and promising to talk the next day, and Ethan forced a supportive smile before ending the call, but the disappointment lingered, and when Patricia arrived unexpectedly with a warm casserole, saying she had a feeling he might be having a long evening, he felt a wave of relief that unsettled him. They ate together at the dining table, conversation flowing smoothly. laughter returning more easily than it had in days, and at some point, Patricia reached across the table to emphasize a story, her fingers brushing his hand. Briefly, and though the touch was innocent, neither pulled away instantly, the contact lasting a second longer than usual before they both adjusted their posture. The moment passed without comment, yet it shifted something internal, because Ethan became acutely aware of boundaries that had once felt solid but now seemed thinner. Later that night, as he stood alone washing dishes after she left, he replayed the interaction in his mind, questioning whether he was reading too much into it or not enough, reminding himself that comfort does not equal betrayal, that proximity does not automatically mean danger, yet the unease remained. Patricia, too, seemed more thoughtful in the days that followed, her tone occasionally softer, her compliments more personal, telling him he deserved recognition for supporting Olivia's journey, telling him any woman would appreciate such loyalty, and while the words were not inappropriate, they carried emotional weight that lingered long after she spoke them. Ethan found himself dressing a little more carefully on evenings he expected her visit, tidying the house more thoroughly, choosing conversation topics that might impress her, small changes he barely admitted to himself. Meanwhile, Olivia's world expanded with internships and networking events, her excitement genuine, her independence growing stronger, and Ethan supported her openly while privately wrestling with feelings he could not fully name. One cold evening, snow beginning to fall lightly outside, Patricia stayed later than usual, and as they sat on the couch discussing holiday plans, their shoulders nearly touching, silence settled between them again, deeper this time, filled with unspoken awareness of how close they had grown, and Ethan felt the temptation to lean into that comfort, to let the loneliness dissolve into something easier, yet at the same time a clear voice in his mind reminded him of his vows, of the trust Olivia placed in him across thousands of miles. The conflict was not loud or dramatic, but steady and real, because emotional lines often blur quietly long before anyone notices. And as Patricia stood to leave that night, pausing slightly at the door as if considering something unsaid, Ethan realized that what had begun as simple support had evolved into a fragile connection that required careful choices, and he understood that if he did not address it soon, the space between gratitude and attachment might disappear entirely. Winter arrived in Boston with a quiet, cold intensity, and with it came a growing awareness in Ethan Parker that the emotional closeness he shared with Patricia Morgan had shifted in ways he could no longer ignore because what began as simple gratitude and companionship while Olivia was away had grown into a subtle dependency that neither of them had fully acknowledged. The house was quiet most nights, Olivia buried in classes and group projects across the country, and Ethan found himself eagerly anticipating Patricia's visits, moments when the room felt warmer, conversations flowed easily, and the loneliness he usually carried dissolved temporarily, yet each interaction now carried a weight he felt but could not name, and he began to notice how much her attention affected him, the way her smile made the dull winter evenings feel lighter, the way her laughter seemed to fill empty spaces in the house that had been silent for months. One snowy evening, as they prepared dinner together, Ethan realized he had grown accustomed to her presence in a way that was no longer purely casual. The small gestures, the way she brushed her hair back, the careful way she measured ingredients, the soft tone she used when correcting him gently, lingering in his thoughts long after she had left, and he felt both warmth and unease simultaneously because he knew the boundaries were shifting. After dinner, they lingered at the kitchen table with tea, the room dimly lit by a single lamp, and their conversation wandered from Olivia's childhood memories to Patricia's own life experiences, the hardships she had endured after her divorce, the loneliness of evenings spent alone, and Ethan listened intently, feeling a connection that went deeper than he had ever expected, the shared understanding of solitude and responsibility, creating a bond that was comforting, yet dangerous, because it stirred emotions he had sworn to keep in check. One night, a storm raged outside, snow falling thick against the windows, and the power flickered intermittently, leaving the room in soft shadows, and they sat on the couch, close but not touching. The silence between them loaded with awareness of the emotional tension that neither wanted to name. The kind of quiet that speaks louder than words, and Ethan felt a pull toward comfort, the urge to lean into the companionship Patricia offered, while simultaneously remembering his vows and the distance that should exist between them. During these weeks, he noticed small habits forming. He would find excuses to tidy the living room before her arrival, choose his words more carefully, share stories he thought she would find interesting, and look forward to her opinions on minor decisions, from the layout of the kitchen to the books on the shelf, while Olivia's calls grew shorter, more distracted, and he felt a subtle guilt he did not fully understand. The realization dawning that emotional intimacy can grow quietly in the absence of physical presence, and that temptation is often as simple as being seen and understood. One evening, while reviewing bills and receipts at the dining table, their hands brushed as they reached for the same stack of papers, and for a brief moment, neither moved away immediately, the contact fleeting but meaningful. And in that second, Ethan felt the depth of the line he was approaching, the awareness of how much comfort and attraction can overlap, and how easily one can drift without realizing it. He pulled back first, his voice low as he said, "We have to be careful. This isn't right." And Patricia's eyes glistened with emotion, a mixture of understanding and unspoken acknowledgement of the closeness that had grown between them. Yet they did not need to say more. The incident hung in the air, a silent recognition that boundaries were being tested, not through deliberate action, but through shared vulnerability, long conversations, and the human need for connection. In the following days, Ethan reflected on every visit, every glance, every joke shared, realizing that what had started as mere help and companionship had evolved into a subtle emotional attachment, and the awareness weighed on him heavily because he loved Olivia, trusted Olivia, and yet had allowed his own loneliness to create space for someone else's presence to feel indispensable. Patricia, too, seemed to sense the shift, her tone softer during visits, her laughter lingering longer than necessary, small gestures of care extended just a bit more, yet always respectful, always aware of the line, and Ethan recognized that their emotional dance was fragile, balance between comfort and the potential for something he could not permit. He began making conscious efforts to redirect his attention, reminding himself that Olivia was the center of his life, yet he found that the moments without her, nights alone, the quiet house, the long hours of work completed in solitude, pulled him back toward Patricia's visits, that her presence filled a gap he could not otherwise ignore. And he questioned himself endlessly, examining motives, acknowledging feelings, and wrestling with guilt, because emotional temptation, unlike physical betrayal, can creep quietly, almost unnoticed, until the moment it demands acknowledgement. One snowy night, after Patricia left following a particularly long visit, Ethan sat alone on the couch, replaying their conversations, the laughter, the subtle touches, and the way her eyes seemed to look at him with understanding, and he realized that the emotional line had blurred far more than he wanted to admit, that he had allowed longing and loneliness to shape his reactions, and that recognition alone was not enough. He would need deliberate action to preserve his marriage. He decided that honesty with himself was critical, that acknowledging the danger without judgment was necessary, and that he must create space to reconnect with Olivia even from afar, reaffirming their bond in ways beyond casual phone calls, letters, and video chats, because the risk of drifting emotionally could not be underestimated. Over the next weeks, he began small changes, consciously limiting the length of visits, focusing conversations on practical matters, resisting moments of emotional indulgence, while Patricia, perceptive as always, adjusted too, respecting the boundaries even as her care and warmth remained constant, creating a delicate balance between companionship and restraint. Yet even with awareness and caution, Ethan felt the tension in quiet moments, the brush of hands passing a dish, the shared look over a dinner table, the comfortable silence during snowy evenings, reminding him that emotional temptation is subtle, that feelings can grow in the absence of opportunity for misbehavior, and that vigilance of the heart is often harder than vigilance of the body. Part 3 unfolded not with dramatic confrontation or overt betrayal, but with a slow, steady recognition that two human beings, spending time in shared space during moments of vulnerability, can develop bonds that must be carefully managed, and that protecting love requires not only faithfulness in action, but also discipline in thought, restraint in longing, and awareness of how easily loneliness can redirect the heart, setting the stage for choices that would ultimately define loyalty, honesty, and the future of his marriage with Olivia. By the time winter melted into early spring, Ethan Parker had spent countless nights reflecting on the delicate balance he had maintained with Patricia Morgan, realizing that emotional closeness, though subtle and innocent, had the power to shape decisions and feelings in ways he could not ignore, because what had begun as simple companionship and help around the house had evolved into a quiet dependence that, if left unchecked, might have jeopardized the trust and love he shared with Olivia. He understood now that awareness alone was not enough, that proactive choices were necessary to restore boundaries and reaffirm loyalty, and one Saturday morning, he called Patricia to meet at a small cafe, choosing neutral ground so they could speak openly without the weight of the house or habitual routines. And when they sat across from each other, the sunlight through the large windows reflected off the rain-soaked streets outside, setting a calm, contemplative atmosphere, the kind that demanded honesty. Ethan spoke first, his voice steady but sincere, explaining how much he valued her care and support over the past months, acknowledging the comfort her presence had brought during Olivia's absence, and admitting that in moments of solitude and longing where he had felt emotions he could not fully control. Yet he emphasized that his heart and loyalty belonged entirely to Olivia, and that he would not allow circumstances to blur the lines between gratitude and attachment. Patricia listened, her expression calm but filled with subtle emotion, and she nodded slowly, confessing that she too had sensed a closeness that had grown unintentionally. That shared concern for Ethan and Olivia's absence had created moments where emotional boundaries were tested, yet she agreed fully that maintaining respect, distance, and clarity was now essential for the well-being of the family. Their conversation was long but composed, not filled with anger or guilt, but with understanding and mutual acknowledgement that both had acted with care, but had been caught in a delicate emotional cross-current. And by the time they parted that afternoon, there was a quiet relief, a recognition that the potential for missteps had been addressed before it became a real issue, and both left with dignity intact. In the days following, Patricia's visits became brief and clearly defined, limited to helping with practical family matters or checking in about Olivia's schedule. And Ethan felt an immediate shift in the emotional landscape of the house, the quiet tension replaced by a calm, respectful rhythm, while he began dedicating more time and energy to connecting with Olivia, scheduling longer video calls, sending thoughtful messages, and planning occasional trips to see her whenever possible, ensuring that emotional intimacy with his wife grew steadily even across distance. As spring matured into summer, Olivia returned home for a brief visit, and Ethan prepared the house carefully, noticing how naturally he had stepped back from relying on Patricia's presence. And when Olivia arrived, the reunion was heartfelt and emotional, filled with laughter, hugs, and the kind of ease that comes from trust restored. And in those moments, Ethan realized how critical it had been to confront the situation with Patricia directly, because loyalty and honesty were far stronger when tested than when assumed. During Olivia's visit, Patricia dropped by for a short, clearly defined family gathering, greeting her daughter with warmth and embracing Ethan politely, but every interaction remained within boundaries, demonstrating that respect and care could coexist without emotional confusion. And Ethan felt a sense of closure knowing that the delicate period of tension had been resolved maturely, without scandal or misstep, preserving family harmony. Afterward, Ethan reflected on the lessons of the months Olivia had been away. That loneliness can subtly redirect the heart, that emotional temptation often arises in quiet, unassuming ways, and that the strength of love is measured not only by physical fidelity, but by restraint of feelings, conscious choices, and constant awareness of boundaries. And he understood that growth in a relationship is forged in both action and reflection, in recognizing vulnerability before it creates consequences, and in taking responsibility for emotional integrity. As Olivia prepared to return to California to continue her program, Ethan felt confident in their relationship. Having rebuilt trust, reinforced connection, and strengthened communication, knowing that distance no longer posed a threat to emotional stability, and that any future challenges could be navigated with honesty and openness. Months later, when she completed her studies and moved back home permanently, the Parker household felt full once again. The lessons of absence and restraint woven quietly into daily routines, family interactions, and small gestures of care. And Ethan recognized that what nearly became an emotional crossing with Patricia had ultimately reinforced the love and loyalty he held for Olivia, teaching him that awareness, courage, and timely action preserve what truly matters. Even in ordinary moments, sharing breakfast, watching Sophie ride her bike, walking in the neighborhood, Ethan carried the subtle understanding that the heart can wander if neglected, that emotional temptation exists in small, quiet ways, and that steadfast love is as much about discipline and boundaries as it is about passion and affection. And with this clarity, he moved forward confidently, grateful for the challenge that taught him how to protect his marriage, cherish his family, and navigate complex feelings with integrity, proving that loyalty and emotional resilience can survive even when tested by time, distance, and human vulnerability.